I think there are a few essential tools if you want to study the Bible and kind of be fairly serious about it. One, of course, is a reliable translation of the Bible. Uh, Quick bunny trail. Every translation from the original language into English is to one degree or another an interpretation because a word for word translation just won't work. Uh, that's that's true of virtually every language coming into English. Um, so the second thing then would be a concordance. This allows you to remember a snatch of a phrase and find all the places that a key word from that phrase appears in the scriptures. It is tremendously helpful. I still love to use the only thing I inherited from my paternal grandfather was his Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible. It uses the King James Version of the Bible for all of its key wording, but it has terrific dictionaries of Greek and Chaldean in the back of it, and each word has a numerical number that is associated with that word. You find that number in the dictionaries and you get the original root meanings of those words. It's terrifically helpful if you encounter a phrase or a word that doesn't quite, that you've got to do some more interpreting with. And so, by the way, my printer is doing an update and making all kinds of racket, and I just have to thank Hewlett Packard for holding my entire system hostage while it goes through all these hoops of hardware, firmware, software. Anyway, those are my complaints for today. Where was I? Oh yeah. And then the third tool would be a Bible atlas. There's lots of versions of the Bible atlases. Most study Bibles have a reasonable and pretty decent set of maps, in the back, and those can be really helpful. The more I study Scripture, the more I realize the location of these landmarks, towns, cities, villages, these places that are in Scripture. It's worth knowing what that is in reference to our modern world. And one of the places I think that this is helpful is right here in 1 Timothy chapter 1. In verse 3, Paul writes, "As I urged you when I went to Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus, so that you may command certain people not to teach the false doctrines any longer." Now, before we get into the teaching aspect here, Macedonia and Ephesus, depending on how you're looking at it, are separated by many miles. Macedonia is up in what is today Greece. Ephesus is in what is today Turkey. So they're geographically well separated. Here's an interesting thing about that. Paul says, as I urged you when I went to Macedonia. So he says, stay there in Ephesus, which here's what leads me to believe that Paul and Timothy were in Ephesus, and Paul decided, I'm going to go to Macedonia. This was not his first trip to Macedonia, but he decided to go and urged Timothy to stay there in Ephesus because there was work to do. And here is the work. Before we look at the work, just realize Paul leaving and going to Ephesus was not like saying, hey, I'm going to go to a couple of towns over, and if you need me, send somebody and I'll be there. No, this was going from Ephesus to Macedonia would have taken potentially a month or more. That you didn't just hop on a plane or a bus or a train or get in your car and go around the Mediterranean Sea. You either you hiked or you took a boat, and these were not power boats. So anyway, okay, we've talked about lots of the ancient technologies and limitations of life, so you're familiar with that already. What Paul was telling Timothy subtly is, I'll be praying for you, but I'm going to be a long ways off. So I'm going to give you instructions. And now he's writing to Timothy after the fact to encourage and instruct and to urge him on in his mission. What was his mission? Command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. We don't know who the certain people were. What I get from that is Paul was saying, okay, now this is not just this broad thing to everybody in the church at Ephesus. This would have been directed at specific individuals, and they were teaching false doctrines. What's false doctrine? Well, duh, that's not hard. Whatever is not a true doctrine is a false doctrine. And in order to know what is a false doctrine, you better know what is a true doctrine and what fits within the structure and confines of true doctrine. Now, also bear this in mind. The church had been established in about 33 AD, right, in Jerusalem. Now, this was in the mid-60s, 30 years later, and there was no codification, in other words, no full collection of the writings of the apostles and the gospel writers. And so what they had would have been fragmented pieces of these various letters and documents that had been written and then saved, passed around, copied to be passed around. They didn't have, boy, we take so for granted one of the most significant, huge benefits that we have today. We have the Bible. They didn't. They had oral teaching. They had some copied documents of letters that became parts of our Bible. So here's the thing. Today, they're floating around dozens and more than dozens of false doctrines, what we would today call heresies. And we've got the entire Bible easily accessible to us. That just wasn't true in century 1 for Timothy and the church at Ephesus. They would have had potentially a few of the letters. What they had was the Old Testament and the direct teachings that they had received from Paul in the 3 years that he had basically been a temporary resident of Ephesus. Now, these specific people, I think, had been given a role of teaching. There are people who teach without having that role, and it could have been that these were that would have been what these people were. But the point is, they were promoting ideas, concepts, teaching that was false. This a doctrine, doctrine gets kind of a bad rap in the modern church because we don't want to be tied to doctrine. We want to be tied to Jesus. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And if you're going to be tied to Jesus, you're going to be tied to doctrine about him. And so doctrine is simply what is taught and believed. Okay, so you got true doctrine, false doctrine, what we're taught and what we believe. This is the foundation of our faith and practice. He goes on in verse 4, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. Now we're kind of getting a little bit of the curtain pulled back for what false doctrines were being taught. I think it has to do with these myths and endless genealogies. And I can't even tell you what the specific myths are and what the whole genealogical thing was about. I do know that, think about this. In Ephesus, their basic, fundamental, pre-Christian beliefs were founded on myths. That Zeus had sent a goddess, Diana, Artemis, to earth. She splashed down in Ephesus or near Ephesus, and that likeness of her was set up as the local goddess, the local deity. And all of that was a myth. So Ephesus kind of was set up for paying attention to giving credence to myths. And before the gospel made it there, that was their religious system, a system of mythology. I don't know that these false teachers were teaching that mythology. There is a real possibility that they were somehow trying to build a hybrid, but and in their mind, I think they would have been trying to build a bridge between Artemis worship and God worship, and aren't they very similar? And don't we have the same God? And aren't we all going to the? Whoa! Now I'm starting to sound like a lot of modern teachers. I don't know. Now on the genealogy side, the genealogy was very important to Hebrews. It was thought to be essential that you could track your heritage, your genealogy, as far back as Noah or Adam. And there are people that still do that. Why? Because your genealogy gave you an element of status. Okay. I don't think genealogy is an evil thing. Learning where you came from, what could be evil about that? Well, only this, that if learning where I came from is ammunition for me to think of myself and act as though I were more significant than somewhere else because of where they came from, we call that the sin of pride. Look in the mirror. Is there any mythology that you're kind of falling into or have picked up over time? Maybe. And it would take me a long time to get into a long list of current mythology, so I'm not going to right now. And then the second question is, so what are you hoping will give you status before God and as as his person? Those are important questions. Now, we'll connect again next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.